My name is Taylor Reddish, and I'll be presenting post-war period education. I'll let you read this background on life in the United States. And then moving on, I'll let you read important historical events. And now I want to talk about education laws and the rulings that happened between 1950 and 1980. So the first ruling was on May 17th in 1954, where Chief Justice Earl Warren ruled that separate facilities are inherently unequal. And this pertained to education in schools. So 30,000 black teachers were kicked out in the name of integration, basically, and African Americans lost a lot of black representation in school. This led to a lot of problems in the southern states in schools, where the southern states were basically fighting the federal law and they did not want to comply to the federal law. And eventually we are led up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity in all federally funded programs, most notably schools. So states and school districts could lose their federal funding if they refused to desegregate their schools. Next is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which provided an unprecedented aid of $4 billion to aid disadvantaged students. Most Southern schools, as I just talked about, ignored the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. But when money became involved, the federal government could police the school systems because if they were not integrating, they could cut off their funds. So 8 years after the Civil Rights Act, finally 91% of Southern black children would attend integrated schools. Next, we have the Bilingual Education Act, which helped to meet needs of children whose first language is not English. Mexican American students at this time were struggling for representation and respect in schools. They could be punished if they spoke Spanish in the predominantly Mexican American school. So this act was passed to help that. Also, in 1974, the federal government published new teaching materials in almost 70 different languages and allocated $68 billion for bilingual programs as a result of a Chinese American lawsuit in San Francisco. Next, we'll be moving on to the rest of the educational laws and rulings. So Title IX was passed and it prohibited federal grants to schools of programs that were discriminated based on gender. So in 1974, the lawsuit by Women's Equality Action League charged the federal government with the failure to enforce the Title IX. So because of this, there were more female athletes and more female sports teams. Bias-free textbooks were made and vocational courses were made co-ed. Next, the National Defense Education Act of 1958 called for strengthening science, math, and foreign language programs due to the launch of Sputnik by the Soviets. This was the space race, so we were pushing for more math and science education. Then there was the Vocational Education Act of 1963, which quadrupled the amount of money allocated for vocational education. This led to, in 1965, the Project Head Start Act, which established to boost the early learning of children ages 3 to 6 from low-income homes. And lastly, we have Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, which granted children with disabilities the right to an education that meets their needs in the least restrictive ways possible. So now we'll be moving on to what were schools like and what were they like around the country. Well, to start off, this was a time of deep segregation, so black schools did not have nearly as many things as white schools did. Black schools would have textbooks that would be 4 to 5 years behind, and they were used by white schools, so they would be leftover textbooks. For women, there were no athletic teams or scholarships for college until Title IX was passed. After the integration protocols and the separate but equal was ruled unjust, The southern states were not complying to the law. For example, in 1957, the governor of Arkansas called out the National Guard rather than having 9 black teenagers integrate at Little Rock Central High School. But President Dwight Eisenhower sent federal troops to enforce this law. It was a really difficult process for African American children, and most parents did not want their children to be put through this. Even 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education, 98% of black children were still in all black schools. For the Mexican Americans, 75% of Mexican Americans dropped out by college. Crystal City, Texas was the new site to equalize opportunity. In that city, as I said before, you were punished if you spoke Spanish. 87% of the Mexican Americans were students at that school, but the majority of the teachers, board members, and the principal was white. So this caused a lack of representation in Mexican American schools. And it also led to the Chicano civil rights movement, which I will talk about later. Students with disabilities were separated into different classrooms until a reform was made. And Chinese Americans suffered unfair treatment, especially in San Francisco, California, as the majority of their classes were taught in English until a reform was made. Next, we'll be moving on to who went to school. During this time period of 30 years, all the children went to school, but this was also the period of desegregation. So African Americans with a high school diploma in 1950 was 13.7%, but in 1980 it was moved up to 51.5% because of desegregation. Medical law and law degrees awarded to women in 1950 were 0.095%, and in 1980 it had jumped up to 30%. And the average school attendance in 1950 was 9 years, and in 1980 it was 12.5 years. So the education system made massive steps forward during this time period into a positive direction to getting everyone equally educated so they could all have equal opportunities. Next, I'll be moving on to what was taught in the schools and why the students learned it. Due to the space race, there was a large focus on science, math, and foreign language programs in this period to encourage higher order thinking skills and problem-solving abilities. The launching of Sputnik encouraged immediate changes in American education, and the math and science emphasis prepared students for college and for jobs later in life. There were vocational skills taught, but they were segregated by gender until reform was made. After that reform was made, women could take any vocational classes they wanted, but there was a heavy gender bias in school, so women were taught to adopt stereotypical female roles, like the housewife roles, like baking and taking care of babies, while men would take stereotypical male roles, like the breadwinner, where they would be focusing on more science, math, medical-related things. This was slowly changed due to reforms. Next, we have how content was taught. Content was taught really similarly as it is today. A class lesson plan would look very similar, but the main methods included were inquiry-oriented, problem-solving, multiple texts, multimedia use, hands-on, and issue-centered. Vocations were more popularly taught during this time period, especially because you don't see them very often now. In fact, most schools that I've heard of don't have woodworking anymore. But woodworking and baking were included in those schools back then. There's a strong emphasis put on curriculum because of Ralph Taylor and his influence on education, and he believed that learning should have both specific objectives and appropriate assessments. So this is the impact on today's education period. Schools are now integrated today, and there is still a push for equal opportunity for all students of all backgrounds. There is a push for diverse students as well as low socioeconomic students to have equal opportunity as other students. There are many bilingual programs now to help students learn English if it's not their first language, but there is also foreign language programs for native English speakers to learn a second language. A debate that continues in today's time is, was the goal to bring non-English speakers into the mainstream like the government wanted, or was it to preserve diverse languages and cultures as the activists in Crystal City, Texas during the Chicano movement had hoped? Back during the Chicano movement, civil rights movement, there was a big push for preserving culture and language because in that time the school system was forcing English upon the students, the Mexican American students, as well as the Chinese students over in San Francisco. But the civil rights movement for them pushed to preserve their language and not make it go extinct. Today, there are still debates on affirmative action, desegregation, the definition of feminism, and there's a debate on if special needs children are getting too much money. Next is the influential educators and their contributions. So Ralph Tyler, he proposed that data concerning the needs of the learner, society, and subject area should be significantly considered in the process of developing curricula. So his legacy mainly centered around curriculum development. In his curriculum development, it was determining the goals of school, selecting learning experiences useful in attaining the goals, organizing instruction around the experiences, and then deciding how to best evaluate learning. The next influential educator is Benjamin Bloom, and he developed Bloom's taxonomy, which examines cognitive, affective, and psychomotor domains of educational activity. It provides a way to structure both activities and questions that are on the spectrum of intellectual processing. Bloom believed that comparing students is not as important in terms of assessment as helping students master their learning. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you for listening.